Hey Sparkers, today I'm going to talk about the settings within each of the amp models. So every single amp model, all 30, have the same controls within them. So not including the effects pedal controls. Within the amp itself, you have gain, bass, middle, treble, and finally volume. And again, this is on every single amp. It's also on the Spark itself on the top. It starts with this looks like the second knob, right after the amp selector knob. You have those same exact 5 controls right on top of the Spark amp. I'll show a photo of that too. So how these different knobs work, they're the same on every single amp model. And generally you find these on all amps as well, and I think that's kind of why they organize them this way. So I have a built-in preset here called Silver 120 Even, and I just call it even because I basically leveled out to the middle setting for all of these controls just to kind of give you a sense of a starting point, right? I typically try to aim for something like this whenever I'm starting to dial in a tone. So that's how it helps to kind of hear what the different tones are like if you start from the middle. So I'm just going to play a chord. This is going to sound pretty ugly because it's a pretty dry, clean, middle tone. There's nothing going on here. So that's just a C chord, E, D. Not much going on there. This is the JC Silver 120 Even. And so the first thing is the gain. So the gain is essentially how much signal is coming into the amp model, right? So on the cleaner amp models, you're basically, that's kind of a warm input, right? The higher you set it, the more warmth you have in your tone. The lower you set it, it sounds a little colder, so or softer. So it's not a volume control, obviously, but it's sort of the level of the signal coming in. So the less you have, the kind of lower it sounds. So I'm going to drop this down, and you'll barely be able to hear this now. Yeah, I can't hear it at all, actually. So, and then you raise it up, and you get kind of this is where we were at the beginning, and then a little bit higher, you'll hear kind of a warmer sound. All right, so that's the incoming signal, essentially. On some of the higher gain amps, this is where you kind of start to add distortion or drive tone. But on the cleaner amps, it's really just going to add warmth or additional signal coming in. So you're going to want to play around with that kind of until you find the tone that you like, right? And so that's gain. Now the 3 next controls are all very similar. But there's obviously a fundamental difference. So bass is how much of the lower end frequencies are coming into your amp, right? So everything kind of below a certain frequency level is going to be raised or lowered depending on where the setting is at. So if you have it at a really low setting, you're not going to hear much of the bass tones. It's kind of, you almost can barely hear them, right? That's the low string there. You can barely hear it compared to the rest. If you raise this up, I'll just put it all the way up so you can hear it. There's quite a bit more bass in there. So those lower frequency tones are going to stand out more when you have that bass level up. And it's similar with the middle setting. So your middle frequencies are going to be raised or lowered depending on that. So if we drop this down, you kind of don't hear those middle frequencies as much. The bass and the highs are going to stand out more when the middle is down. And then raise that up, and it'll just stand out more, right? So you kind of hear the middle of the frequency range quite a bit more. It gives this weird sort of, it's hard to describe that sound of that tone, but that will accentuate those middle tones. And similar with the treble. So if you drop the treble down, those highs just drop off. You'll hear mostly the mids and the lows, right? You bring this up, and although those high shimmery notes will be clearer now. So you can kind of hear that shimmer. Now, another important thing to note here is I have my pickup set on the middle pickup right now. So everything is sort of based on that. Obviously, if I move my pickup to the neck pickup, it's going to be a little bit, more of a warmer, lower tone, down to the the bridge, and you get that higher, more shimmery tone, right? So you can do a lot of fine-tune adjustments, and what you're going to want to do when you're playing with these settings is, make sure that you're playing with all your different pickup settings and you're playing with these different knobs. And I start them in the middle like that, and then I dial it into a sound that I like from there, right? And, you can start with the gain. That's a good place to start when you're adjusting for a tone. But make sure that you're checking again after you go into your bass and you kind of fine tune that bass setting to something you like. Check your gain again. You might like it now a little bit lower or a little bit higher possibly. And same thing, once you adjust sort of from left to right, make sure you're double checking your previous settings. And once you get through all four of those settings, you're going to kind of come to a sound you like. And then finally, what you're going to want to do is adjust your volume, really, which is the output of this amp model. And if you're not using any of the effects pedals, and in this case we're not, the volume isn't going to make a huge difference, but it's when it's used in conjunction with, let's say, a boost or a drive or a compression pedal, where that's going to make a big difference. Right now, it doesn't make a big difference if I turn it up or down. I mean, if I turn it down, you're not going to hear it. If I turn it up, it's going to be loud, right? So that's pretty obvious, but you're going to want to balance that with, what's going on with your however loud you want to hear the amp model, right? And it's going to depend on, your output on your amp itself, right? So if you want to have, I would generally recommend you stick to a kind of a 7 or an 8 o'clock pattern right there, 7 or 8, sorry, not 8 o'clock, 7 or 8 number there. Just generally to keep your tones about the same level, but it's totally going to depend on what your other effects settings are. But essentially that's just an output volume for the amp model itself. And if you have a high gain, you may want to back that volume down a little bit. If you have a lower gain, you're going to need to raise that volume up, right? Just so you can kind of level out the overall sound or the overall volume, right? So that's kind of how those 5 knobs work, and they work the same on every single amp model. I would say, again, the main difference is in the way the gain works across the different amp models. On the higher gain amps, that's going to add some drive, some distortion. But in general, the rest of the knobs work exactly the same way. Now, each of the amp models have a different sort of fundamental sound to them. That's why they're amp models. So this Silver 120 sounds different from the Matchless DC30, for example. Although those are both clean amps, right? So experiment with all the different amp models. I would say, again, start with those, an even sound if you can, something near those 5s. Some people start with a lower gain because the gain does color your tone quite a bit. So you can drop that gain down to 2 or 3, but I find that in a lot of these amp models, it's almost too low to sort of hear at that point. So I just start with 5. And I rarely find myself going much below 5 on the gain control, but in some cases you'll find that to be true. So try to start with something consistent. If you're comparing the different amps, kind of have the levels the same, and that'll give you a really good taste for how they sound different. What I've done is I have all 4 of these clean amps saved as an quote-unquote even tone, right? So here I have the Silver 120 even, Blackface Duo even, AD Clean even, and the Match DC even. And these are just essentially what I just described. The tones are exactly 5. So I can use those as sort of starting points for creating tones, and that's kind of how that works. And you can do the same for any of the other different amp settings, whether it's the crunchy or the glassy or the high gain or the metal amps. It's a good way to start, a good baseline to use. And just play it for a minute or two, and with each of the different pickup positions, just like this. I know it's going to sound not so great, but it'll give you a really good idea for how that amp model works. And then slowly adjust those settings until you find that tone. Now, you could be looking for a very specific tone, or you could be just trying to find something that sounds good, but it's essentially going to work the same way. You're going to want to start with as simple or an even of a position as possible, and then adjust from there. And then again, just to recap, I like to start from left to right, but I work backwards as I update each setting, just to double check, right? You may find that a small tweak after you adjust your middles, for example, you may find that a small tweak to the gain is going to sound really good. So those are my tips on assessing, measuring, and adjusting the amp model controls. It's a good way to kind of find a good tone that you like, or try to find and emulate a tone. Another video I'll do later is trying to emulate a particular tone. And you can either start from a baseline like this, or you can start from a tone that already sounds similar to it. So you might find something on Tone Cloud that's close to a sound you want to emulate or something like that. But anyway, that's it for this video. Hope this helps and enjoy. Thanks.